Hey, I'm just showing you my outfit. Look, I'm wearing an eye. It's all about me. The eyes have it. Hi, welcome back to my show. Have I told you the one about? Tonight it is Grandma Smith's hip. Not Grandma Smith is hip. Grandma Smith's possessive hip. The hip of Grandma Smith, which isn't who'd show up for that. Um, this story goes out to probably my biggest fan, Sandra Jass. She is a sweetheart and she is always sending me sweet little messages and stuff. Look, she sent me a selfie. Happy birthday, Sandra. That's a bit dark. She also sent me a picture of her pussy. Look, there's her kitty cat. I told you it's an adult show. Stop being surprised by my language. Adult show. Pussy. It's just a cat. So, Sandra, happy birthday. You're amazing. Graham Smith's hip. My Graham Smith was hardcore. I already told you a few details, but I'll give you some more. Didn't mean for that to rhyme. I called my sister Lisa to say, what stories do you remember about Grandma Smith? Like, do you have details that I should include? And she said that Grandma Smith never had a bad word for anyone, which is true. I never heard my grandmother badmouth somebody. You could badmouth people around her, and she always found a nice thing to say. It was amazing. She even had nice things to say she'd just say about my crazy Uncle Bob on the other side of the family. She'd just say, oh, that poor Bob. So if you don't have a nasty word to say about Uncle Bob, who was mean to everybody, you're the nicest person on the planet. And Lisa also told me that Grandma Smith always had Christmas dinner at her house. She always made enough for everybody. She always had tons of food, and everybody was invited. And she'd cook the day before and start early in the morning so that at 10 o'clock she could have everything just sitting on the stove ready to go. And some things like cream corn would simmer for hours. So there were some things you just didn't eat so that she could drink the whole day. And oftentimes there were 5 boys, so all their wives or girlfriends would finish the meal because grandma was too drunk by the time supper time came to finish it. So everybody just sort of took over and would finish the meal. And whenever my grandfather retired, he decided that it was time for them to slow down a little. So instead of getting a 2-4 case of 2-4 every day, he'd pick up a 12 for her. So grandma would have 12 beer a day instead of 24. And I remember one time saying, well, Grandpa, why would you just go every day and get a 12? Why wouldn't you just get, a 2-4? And he was like, oh, because grandma would just drink it if it was in the house. And I think I told you the rumor, I didn't see this for myself, and so who knows, right? But the rumor in the family that went around was Grandpa tried to get them to stop drinking and poured all the alcohol down the drain, and he came home and Grandma was drinking Windex. Now, you might wonder, why would a grown woman sit at home in her house so desperate for alcohol that she would drink Windex? Why wouldn't she just go to the store and buy herself her own alcohol? My grandma didn't like to leave the house. Grandma once a year would get in the car and drive an hour with my grandfather who was driving. Grandpa would drive for an hour and go visit her brother and sister and mother who all lived in a house together. And well, actually 2 brothers. My uncle Yon died when I was young, but Yon and Bob and Rita would all live together, the 3 siblings. They never got married. They lived in the house with their mom, and grandma would go visit. She had another sister who lived somewhere else. So she'd visit, or 2 other sisters. She'd visit them too. But anyways, they would come over. So grandma would drive the hour and hang out at the house. And we had to go to the house I think my grandmother, honestly, in my entire life, I don't think my grandmother ever visited my house more than 4 or 5 times. That would be my guess in my recollection, because she didn't like to leave the house. So she'd go for the hour and stay, and then we could go visit her wherever she was. And as she got older, she just went out less and less. My grandfather Smith did all the shopping. He bought all the groceries. I guess she was agoraphobic. And this is the thing with quirks in the family, mental illness maybe, is that people have struggles and you just don't put a name to them. You don't call it agoraphobia when you're a blue collar person living in a small town. Grandma just doesn't like to leave the house. So we would have barbecues at Grandma Smith's place. She'd prepare all the salads and stuff, and people would bring things. And we'd have a big barbecue out in the backyard. And Grandma would come and stand in the doorway. And I remember I didn't realize that. I just knew Grandma was in the house all the time. But I thought that's because she was a drinker and a smoker and she just liked to sit at the kitchen table, right? And one day there was a barbecue and she was standing in the doorway. And this is when all the light bulbs went off because I said, Grandma, why don't you just, come join us? And she was like, oh, I'm going to be out there in a minute. She was like, I'm fine where I am. And I'm like, yeah, but we're all eating. Don't you want to eat? You did all that work. And because I was getting older, so I was having more agency. So I was trying to, encourage her to join us. And so I must have said it three different ways, like three different reasons to come out. Like, oh, well, we're all starting. And if you don't come, and she just said no each time. And I went, oh, Grandma doesn't want to leave the house. And then I mentioned it to one of my aunts, and she was like, yeah, no, your grandmother doesn't leave the house. Like, your grandmother's an agoraphobic. She's an agoraphobe. And I was like, holy cow. It's so weird to have language put to something that you've lived with your whole life and you just never realized. It was this strange experience of, well, it's those aha moments, but it's the aha moments which color everything you thought you knew about your family. All the things I thought about my grandmother sort of reorganized themselves and landed in a new configuration, a new insight. Same thing happened whenever we were quite a bit younger. I don't know. I was probably in my teens, I guess. And Grandma always had white hair the whole time. She wasn't much older than my dad. She was, I think, when I was born, she was probably 40. I think, because my parents were teenagers when they had my sister, and Mom was 20. So yeah, Grandma Smith was about 40 when I was born, but she was already white. She had little bits of um, other color, like a dark color in her hair, but I didn't think much of it because we were kids. So by the time I was 10, she was completely white, and she had this blonde streak in the front, this like blonde streak. She had really thick white hair. And one day we were looking at photographs. We are going through the photo album, and I saw a picture of my grandfather with this woman with dark, dark hair. And I was like, who's that? And Grandma was like, that's me. And I was like, what do you mean? Why do you have dark hair? I thought you were a blonde. She was like, no, I was never a blonde. Why do you think I was a blonde? She went from black to white, but the blonde streak, the yellow streak in the front of her hair was from cigarette smoke. She smoked so much, it discolored the front of her hair and made it yellow. That was a big aha moment for me too. I heard my sister wanted me to remind you, or to tell you, she was reminding me that Grandma's fingers were always, Lisa called them gold, but she said actually they were more brown, like they were sort of brown with some bits of gold in them, because she smoked nonstop all day. My Grandma Smith was hardcore. She had one friend, Ruby, who was her neighbor, that lived across the street, and then they moved. My grandmother moved into a new house, and then she was kitty corner. Their backyards touched, so they didn't move very far. And yeah, so she didn't leave the house hardly at all, ever. And when she got older, she just never left the house. That was it. She stopped going to Cornwall to visit her siblings. Her siblings died before her, but she didn't come visit us. She never left the house. And I'd moved to Vancouver by the point where she was housebound, essentially. And so that's why she would drink Windex, because she didn't want to leave the house to go get alcohol. It's fascinating, right? This is my family. This is my blood family. So Grandma has a fall. And when I'm living in Vancouver, my dad calls me and says, your grandmother's fallen. She isn't doing very well. And the story goes that Grandma fell, hurt herself, and she eventually crawled her way to the couch. She couldn't be picked up by my grandfather. She crawled her way to the couch. She laid down on the couch, and she laid there for 3 days. Yes, I'm wearing yellow hair for my grandmother. I am. I am actually wearing yellow hair just for my grandmother. My friend Ethica is writing to ask. She laid on the couch for 3 days. Don't distract me. Laid on the couch for 3 days. Whenever she had to go to the bathroom, she'd get up and she'd crawl and go to the washroom, and then she'd go back to the couch. Well, the minute she fell, Grandpa knew something was up. He called the boys, he called his kids and told them, and one by one they came over to check on her. And she refused to go to the hospital. She would not go to the hospital. She was going to be fine. And it was pretty obvious that she wasn't going to be fine. She was in some considerable pain, obviously. She had alcohol to help numb some of the pain. But on the third day, it was really clear that she wasn't doing very well. And no amount of convincing was going to work. So I think it was my Uncle Ted got the smart idea. He said, I'm going to call the police, and the police are going to come, and then we're going to give her the option. And that's what they did. So the police show up. It's the RCMP in Kempville. They show up at her door, and Ted's there. And they say, okay, well, we understand that you've had a fall. You've been on the couch for 3 days. You're not getting better. So you have two options. Either you can come with Ted in his car, or is it come with us? I can't remember. Or we're going to call an ambulance. And that's funny. See, I thought I knew this part and I don't now that I got here. Anyways, she decided that she was going to, I think she went in the police car. But here's the part of the story that I remember for sure. She didn't want anybody to touch her. So Ted picked her up, scooped her in his arms, lifted her up, put her wherever she needed to be. Maybe the ambulance came. They got her to the hospital. They give her x-rays, and she has split her pelvis clear in half. My grandmother Smith fell and split her pelvis in two pieces, clearly demarked on the x-rays, and she laid on the couch and got herself to the toilet and back for 3 full days and never once cried out in pain. My grandmother was hardcore. So she slowly got a little bit better, but eventually, I think about 6 months later, she got pneumonia and my Grandma Smith died. I never got to see her. I was living in Vancouver. I was really broke. I didn't have the money. And I called my dad and said, okay, well, I've thought about it and I just want to check in with you. I don't know what I'm going to do about the funeral. I don't know if I'm going to come home or not. And Dad said, I don't think you need to come home. I don't need you there. And that's what I was worried about. I was like, well, I want to be there for you. I don't need to go home to say goodbye to Grandma. Like, seeing her dead body isn't going to help me at all. But I want to be there for you. And he said, I'm going to be fine. I have your sister. I have my brothers. Don't worry about it. So I didn't. And I think that's one of the big regrets of my life. I really wished I'd have gone home to see her. We weren't very close. Like, I didn't see my grandparents very much, and my grandparents, Cooper, spoiled us and paid us a lot of attention. We were the only grandkids, and Grandma Smith had all kinds of grandkids, and we lived an hour away. And I know she loved me, and I loved her, but we weren't intimate. I'm way more intimate with you, little green dot on my computer screen, and all you listeners, than I was with my Grandma Smith. But I really loved her dearly because she was just a beautiful person. She didn't have a bad word for anyone. How can you live like that? I can't live like that. Are you kidding? I'm such a bitch. She was the farthest thing from that. So I didn't go home. I called Dad after the funeral. He told me all about it. And I talked to my sister and I was still living in debt. And how many years later? It must have been 3 or 4 years later. My grandfather Smith, I remember he died, and I actually was home. I was home for Christmas that year, so I got to see him in the hospital, and he wasn't conscious, and I held his hand, and it was a thing I would have never done. And he ended up passing while I was still in Cornwall, so I got to go to the funeral. And we had the service, and I was with my dad and my sister, and we went out to the back of the church for the internment because Grandpa was buried. And I hadn't realized I'd never gone home and seen my grandmother Smith's grave. And suddenly there was my Grandma Smith's grave in front of me. And I was like, it just wasn't a thing we would do. It wasn't something we did in my family. I don't know where anybody's buried. My great grandmother died in Cornwall, Ontario, and I don't know where she's buried. I don't have a clue. My great aunts and uncles all died in Cornwall, and I don't know where they're buried. I don't have any idea. It just wasn't something we did. And so suddenly without realizing it, I went to my grandfather's funeral, and there's my grandmother's gravestone. And it was really overwhelming. And so I just, held it in, did the whole ceremony of the lowering of the casket, and they said some words and everything else. And we went back into the church, into the hall, so we could have some lunch. And this is a good measure of what my father was like. We got some food and sat down to eat, and I managed to get through the buffet table faster than Dad did. And I was having a moment, and he came back and sat down at the table with me, and I had tears in my eyes, and I couldn't really talk. And Dad looked at me and he said, "What's wrong with you?" And I was like, "Dad, I'm at your father's funeral, and I've just seen my Grandma Smith's grave for the first time, and so I'm a little emotional." And he was like, "Oh." And then he started to eat his lunch. So, you know, that's that. That is Grandma Smith's hip. Whew. See, I'll tell you anything. Because if we're going to be close, we're going to be close. I want to remind you that you can share these, your own stories or your selfie time photos with me at michaelbsmith.com or tweet them. One person's tweeted, but who cares? You don't have to be that tech savvy. I want to remind you that you can like, share, or subscribe. You can click on the notification bell. And I'm going to draw my magic story bag. We're getting down there. There's 10 in there. I have 3 others over here. Oh, there's probably 9 in there now. 3 others over here. I'm going to make it to a month, and then we'll see what happens after that. Here's this. Oh, it's burning. Oh, oh, this one's going to be fun. Worst dates ever. I always say I've gone on the worst dates ever. If you want to send me some worst date stories for tomorrow, I'll read some of them out. But you're not going to beat mine. It's not a competition. Worst dates ever. Okay, well, that's it. Yeah, I showed you my pictures. Yeah, well, there you go. I don't think I forgot anything. So I love you. You're great. Have a great night. Saturday night, do something wild. See you tomorrow. Oh, selfie time. Wait, here, we're going to give you selfie time right here. Bye.